The village liked to believe it knew its own mind. Every path was familiar, every face politely understood, every house placed neatly into a story that felt finished. Hawthorne Rise was one such house, admired for its order and respected for its silence. Yet silence, Miss Marple knew, was never empty. It collected glances, unfinished sentences, and footsteps heard after dark. When small habits begin to change and ordinary things feel slightly out of place, it is rarely coincidence. It is warning. And as Miss Marple listened to the village speak around what it feared to name, she sensed that a quiet house was beginning to tell its secrets far too loudly to be ignored. Chapter 1. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable sort that settled over the village in the afternoon, but a listening silence. The kind that seemed to pause just long enough to hear itself breathe. It was mentioned first by Mrs. Grant at the post office, in a tone meant to sound casual, that Hawthorne Rise never quite slept anymore. Lights were said to be on long after midnight, curtains shifting when no wind stirred, and the faint suggestion of movement where none should be. Miss Marple heard this while waiting patiently for her stamps, her expression mild, her attention keen, storing the remark with gentle care. Hawthorne Rise sat at the edge of the village green, a well-maintained house with trimmed hedges and windows polished to a respectable shine. It had always been thought of as orderly and proper, much like its owner, Mrs. Eleanor Everly. Miss Marple had known her for years, though not intimately. They shared the sort of acquaintance built from polite greetings, shared teas, and brief conversations after church. It was enough for Miss Marple to know when something had shifted. That afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at Hawthorne Rise. Mrs. Everly had extended it with a brightness that felt just slightly too deliberate, as though the invitation itself were meant to prove something. Miss Marple arrived promptly, noting the way the front door opened a fraction of a second too late, as if the person inside had paused to compose herself. Mrs. Everly greeted her warmly, though her smile did not quite settle. Her hands fluttered for a moment, straightening a cushion that was already perfectly aligned. Miss Marple took in the hallway as she stepped inside, her eyes resting briefly on the tall grandfather clock positioned against the wall. Its ticking was uneven, the rhythm faltering every few beats. Most people would have dismissed it as age. But Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Everly glanced at it, and then looked away, her lips pressing together just slightly. They moved into the sitting room, where tea was already laid out. The room was pleasant enough, with floral curtains and carefully chosen ornaments. Yet something felt unsettled, as though the air itself had been disturbed and never properly smoothed again. Miss Marple seated herself and accepted her cup with thanks. As Mrs. Everly poured, the china cup rattled faintly against the saucer. It was not a large tremor, barely noticeable, but Miss Marple noticed it all the same. Mrs. Everly set the teapot down a bit too quickly and laughed lightly, making a comment about the weather being cooler than expected. Her tone was cheerful, but her fingers lingered on the handle, as if reluctant to let go. Conversation drifted to harmless topics. The church flower rhoda. A minor dispute over a boundary hedge. Miss Marple listened attentively, occasionally offering a thoughtful remark. When the window was opened to let in some air, voices from the lane outside floated in. Two women passed by, their words half carried on the breeze. Said she saw the light again, one murmured. After midnight this time, came the reply. The voices faded, but Miss Marple had already noted how Mrs. Everly's shoulders stiffened, just slightly, before she resumed speaking. She remarked then on how peaceful the evenings were, how she enjoyed the quiet. Miss Marple smiled and agreed, though she thought privately that people often spoke most about what they wished to believe. When Miss Marple complimented the house, Mrs. Everly's expression softened briefly, then tightened again when Miss Marple mentioned how large it must feel at night. Mrs. Everly laughed too quickly and said she preferred not to think about such things. She rose to fetch a plate of biscuits, moving swiftly toward the kitchen, and Miss Marple observed how she deliberately avoided passing through the small side room near the stairs. Her path curved around it, as if the space itself were unpleasant to acknowledge. Upon her return, Mrs. Everly mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a few pieces of silver had gone missing recently. Nothing important, she said, just a spoon or two misplaced. Her voice was light, dismissive, but Miss Marple noticed how she did not meet her eyes while speaking. When Miss Marple offered a gentle suggestion about keeping an inventory, Mrs. Everly waved the idea away and changed the subject. Tea continued, but the atmosphere remained unsettled. Miss Marple asked quietly about visitors, remarking that the house must see quite a bit of company. Mrs. Everly hesitated before replying, then said she had been quite alone of late. The pause was brief, but to Miss Marple it felt carefully measured. As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted around the room. A chair near the fireplace sat slightly angled, as though it had been moved recently and not returned to its place. The carpet beneath it showed faint marks, subtle but fresh. Miss Marple said nothing, merely filed the observation away. When the conversation turned to village news, Mrs. Everly's tone relaxed somewhat. She spoke of Mrs. Linton's new curtains and Mr. Hale's recent fortune, though she stumbled briefly over Mr. Hale's name, correcting herself with a small laugh. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, thinking how names sometimes became difficult when they carried weight. The visit drew to a close with polite exchanges and warm goodbyes. As Miss Marple stepped back into the hallway, the grandfather clock gave another uneven tick. She paused, tilting her head slightly, and remarked on how such clocks often reflected the mood of a house. Mrs. Everly smiled thinly and said nothing. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly down the path, her thoughts as measured as her steps. She passed Mrs. Grant near the green, who leaned in and whispered that Hawthorne Rise had never been so restless. Miss Marple responded with a mild comment about houses having their seasons, but her eyes lingered on the upper windows of Hawthorne Rise, where a curtain shifted just slightly. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her own small table, reflecting on the day. She considered the trembling teacup, the avoided room, the missing silver, and the way Mrs. Everly's voice changed when the night was mentioned. None of it meant very much on its own. Taken together, however, it formed a pattern that felt disturbingly familiar. Miss Marple had learned long ago that trouble rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived quietly, wrapped in courtesy and small dismissals, waiting for someone to notice. As she folded her napkin and prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt certain that Hawthorne Rise was keeping secrets it could no longer hold. And as the village settled into sleep, Miss Marple, smiling kindly to herself, knew she had just glimpsed the first dark shape cast by something far more serious than mere unease. Chapter 2. On the following morning, the village had already decided what it believed, and it believed it with the cheerful certainty that only a small place can manage. At the bakery counter, Mrs. Finch declared that Hawthorne Rise had always been a peculiar house, only no one liked to say so because Mrs. Everly gave such generous donations at harvest time. At the post box, Mr. Dodd insisted he had heard a carriage wheel on the lane long after midnight, though he could not say from which direction. And outside the church porch, where the air smelled of damp stone and polished wood, Mrs. Grant leaned in to tell anyone who would listen that a light had flickered in the upstairs window at 2 a.m, steady as a watchful eye. Miss Marple arrived at the church hall just as the charity committee was gathering. Her gloves neat, her expression kindly, and her mind quietly alert. The hall was bright with winter sun through tall windows, and the long tables were covered in linen cloths that had been ironed with fierce devotion. There were jars of preserves, lined up like a proud little army, baskets of scones under clean tea towels, and a vase of early daffodils, trying bravely to cheer the room. The ladies, as always, were pleased to be doing good, and equally pleased to have a reason to speak. It was a comfortable rhythm. Someone would mention the raffle prizes. Then the conversation would drift, as it always did, toward what was truly of interest. Mrs. Linton, who chaired the committee with a firmness that she called efficiency, adjusted her spectacles and announced that the proceeds would go to the Parish Relief Fund. Then she immediately mentioned, with the exact same tone, that poor Mrs. Aldridge was having dreadful trouble with her cousin over an inheritance. "It is so unpleasant," Mrs. Linton said, stirring her tea with a sharpness that made the spoon click. "The cousin insists there was a promise. The solicitor insists there was no such thing. And the whole matter has become rather public." Miss Marple's gaze lifted gently, as though she were only interested in the sugar bowl. Yet she listened closely. In a village, inheritance disputes were rarely just about money. They were about pride, and old resentments, and the quiet terror of being made small. Mrs. Finch gave a small laugh. "Promises are made everywhere. People say things in drawing rooms and then pretend they never spoke at all." Mrs. Linton's lips tightened. "Quite." Across the table, Mr. Hale had joined them, invited for his role in managing the accounts for the fundraiser. He was the sort of man who wore respectable suits and spoke with careful politeness, always seeming as though he wished to appear helpful. He was also, Miss Marple noticed, a little too eager to be seen as settled again. "Of course, money matters are best kept clear," Mr. Hale said smoothly. "The trouble comes when people allow feelings to enter." Mrs. Grant, pouring tea, lifted her eyebrows. "Feelings do enter, Mr. Hale. They walk in without knocking." There was a soft ripple of amusement, but Miss Marple saw the faint shift in Mr. Hale's jaw. It was the smallest tightening, quickly smoothed away by a smile. "And you, Mr. Hale," Mrs. Finch said, leaning forward as though she were merely being friendly, "you seem quite recovered these days." "We have all been so relieved." Mr. Hale's smile brightened. "Yes. Things have improved considerably. I have been fortunate." "Fortunate," Mrs. Finch echoed, as though tasting the word. "That is what everyone says." Miss Marple held her teacup and watched him over the rim. His hand went, just for a moment, toward his breast pocket, where a letter might be kept, or a folded note. The gesture was almost unconscious. Then he caught himself and put his hand down. Mrs. Linton returned briskly to the business of the day, but village conversation did not obey agendas for long. A woman at the far end of the table, Mrs. Pritchard, made a remark about how Mrs. Everly had not attended church the previous Sunday. "Not like her," Mrs. Pritchard said, cutting a slice of sponge cake with careful concentration. "She always sits in the second pew, always has her gloves folded the same way. It does make one wonder if she is well." Mrs. Grant sniffed. "She is well enough to be seen at the window, if you ask me." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened with the pleasure of new information. "At the window." "Night after night," Mrs. Grant said, lowering her voice. "And not just once. It is as if she is waiting for something." Miss Marple made a mild sound of interest. "Waiting can be rather tiring," she observed gently. "It can change a person's habits without them quite realizing." Mrs. Linton, who disliked speculation when it was not her own, said sharply, "We should not talk as though Mrs. Everly is a character in a story." But she said it too quickly, too firmly, and Miss Marple noticed the faint flush rising at her throat. Mrs. Linton's tone had shifted. Just there, from irritation to something else. Anxiety, perhaps, or a protective instinct that did not feel entirely natural. The door of the hall opened, letting in a gust of cold air, and Mrs. Dawes, wrapped in a scarf, cheeks pink from the wind. She apologized for being late, and immediately whispered to Mrs. Finch. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Dawes breathed, not nearly as quietly as she intended. "They found a spoon in the hedgerow near Hawthorne Rise. Just lying there, as if someone dropped it in a hurry." Mrs. Finch's eyes sparkled. "A spoon. A silver one," Mrs. Dawes said, nodding. "And not the cheap kind. The sort with initials. The women around them reacted as though a small bell had been rung. A domestic object out of place was far more unsettling than any loud drama. It meant a private space had been disturbed. Miss Marple did not speak at once. She merely adjusted her napkin, as though considering the cake. But her mind turned quietly. A spoon did not leap into a hedgerow. It was carried, dropped, perhaps tossed, perhaps deliberately placed where it might be found. And the initials, Mrs. Grant said, leaning in. Whose were they? Mrs. Dawes hesitated, glancing around as though suddenly remembering propriety. Well, I did not see them myself. But Mrs. Pritchard said they were E.E. Mrs. Pritchard, hearing her name, straightened. That is what I heard. E.E. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Eleanor Everleigh's trembling hand, the way she avoided a certain room, the uneven ticking of the clock. A spoon in a hedgerow could mean very little, or it could mean the beginning of something that might unravel. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. People lose things, he said lightly. It is hardly proof of anything. His tone was pleasant, but something in it felt rehearsed. Miss Marple saw Mrs. Finch glance at him, and for a brief moment her expression sharpened, then softened again into social politeness. Miss Marple spoke calmly. Of course, people do lose things, but it is curious when a lost thing turns up in such an unusual place. Mr. Hale smiled. Curious, yes. And yet he did not drink his tea. He touched the cup, shifted it, and left it untouched. They moved on to arranging the stalls. Miss Marple offered to label jars, a task no one would consider important. It allowed her to sit quietly at the side, observing. People came and went. Voices rose and fell. In every friendly exchange, there were small hesitations and careful omissions. Mrs. Linton stepped aside with Mrs. Finch near the pantry door, and Miss Marple caught a fragment. You cannot mention that here, Mrs. Linton hissed, low and firm. Mrs. Finch replied, equally low, I am not mentioning it. I am simply saying it is odd. Mrs. Linton's hand pressed against the edge of the table, whitening her knuckles. Please. A single word, but it carried weight. Miss Marple looked down at her labels again, as though she had heard nothing. Yet she had heard everything. A little later, Mrs. Pritchard brought a stack of envelopes for thank-you notes. We should send these promptly, she said. People appreciate good manners. Miss Marple took an envelope to address. The paper was thick, proper, with a neat crest. But as she held it, she noticed something small. The flap had been resealed. Very carefully, but not perfectly. A faint wrinkle. A slightly raised edge, where someone had opened it and pressed it down again. It was the sort of thing most eyes would miss, especially in a room full of chatter. But Miss Marple's eyes did not miss small disturbances. Mrs. Pritchard said, Oh, do not mind those. They were delivered to me by mistake last week. I had to open one to see who it was meant for, and then I resealed it. Mrs. Pritchard said it quickly. Too quickly, as though she had prepared the explanation. Miss Marple smiled softly. That is very conscientious of you. Mrs. Pritchard's shoulders eased, relieved to be approved of. But Miss Marple's mind remained quietly unsettled. Letters arriving by mistake. Opened. Resealed. In a village where everyone watched everyone else, a private message was never truly private. Mr. Hale moved closer to the table where the envelopes lay. He reached for one, then stopped, as though suddenly remembering he had no reason to touch them. His fingers hovered a moment, then withdrew. Miss Marple watched the small hesitation and the faint color rising in his cheeks. Mrs. Dawes began speaking about the post again. Such strange deliveries lately, she said, shaking her head. Letters coming at odd hours. Not the morning post, but later, sometimes just after dusk. Mrs. Grant nodded eagerly. I have seen it myself. A boy on a bicycle, not our usual one. He drops something quickly and rides off. Mrs. Linton's spoon clinked sharply against her saucer. "That is enough," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "We are here to raise funds, not to invent tales." The room quieted for a beat. It was not the words, but the intensity beneath them. Mrs. Linton looked around, realizing she had drawn attention, and forced a laugh. "Really," she added more lightly, "we sound ridiculous." The chatter resumed, but it was thinner now, as though everyone had become more aware of what they might be revealing. Miss Marple looked kindly at Mrs. Linton. "It is natural for people to notice changes," she said softly. "When something feels different, one cannot help but look for reasons." Mrs. Linton's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, and for a moment there was something like gratitude there, quickly hidden. "Yes," she said. "Of course." Later, when the meeting ended and people began packing baskets and folding cloths, Miss Marple stepped outside into the cold air. The churchyard was quiet, the gravestones standing in orderly rows. The village lane stretched away toward the green, and beyond it, the gentle rise where hawthorn rise waited behind its hedges. Mr. Hale came out just behind her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice mild, "may I walk with you for a moment?" Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, and they moved at a slow pace. "I do hope the talk does not upset Mrs. Everleigh," Mr. Hale said. Miss Marple glanced at him. "Do you know her well?" He hesitated. "As well as one can know anyone in a village." It was a careful answer, neither yes nor no. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Villages have a way of knowing everyone's habits, even if they do not know their thoughts." Mr. Hale laughed politely. "Quite." As they approached the green, Miss Marple noticed his gaze flick toward the post box, then away. Again, that small, almost involuntary movement, as though the post held something he wished to control. They parted with polite goodbyes. Miss Marple continued on alone, her pace unhurried. Near the hedge that bordered the lane, she saw something pale caught among the leaves. It was a scrap of paper, small and folded, damp at the edges. She did not pick it up at once. She looked around. No one was near. Then, with a practiced calm that did not draw attention, she lifted it carefully. The paper bore a faint line of writing, blurred by moisture. Only a few words could be made out, but one phrase remained readable. "Tonight, do not be late." Miss Marple held it for a moment, her expression gentle, her thoughts sharp. A message dropped, perhaps by accident, perhaps in haste. The village had been speaking of late lights, odd letters, and a house that never quite slept. And as Miss Marple tucked the damp scrap safely away, she walked on with the same mild smile, knowing she had just stepped closer to the secret at the heart of Hawthorne Rise, and that whatever waited for tonight was not meant for comfortable eyes to see. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just heard the quietest warning of all. Chapter 3. The remark was made so quietly that most people missed it altogether. Mrs. Dawes, standing near the butcher's counter, said in a voice pitched halfway between concern and curiosity that Mrs. Everleigh had been asking after old keys, not new ones, not spares from the ironmonger, but old keys, the sort kept in drawers long forgotten, their purpose remembered by no one. Miss Marple, selecting a modest cut of meat, paused just long enough to take note, her expression unchanged, her interest sharpened. Hawthorne Rise had become a subject that surfaced everywhere, never loudly, never directly, but always with a peculiar persistence. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again walking up the familiar path, this time at Mrs. Everleigh's request. The note had been polite, carefully worded, and delivered by hand rather than post. Miss Marple had noticed that immediately. People who chose not to trust the post usually had reasons. Mrs. Everleigh greeted her with the same careful brightness as before, though today there was an edge of fatigue about her. The lines at the corners of her eyes seemed deeper, as though sleep had not come easily. She spoke a little too quickly, ushering Miss Marple inside and apologizing for the state of the house, though everything appeared perfectly arranged. The hallway clock was still ticking unevenly. Miss Marple noted that the sound seemed louder today, echoing faintly as though the house were hollowing around it. Mrs. Everly mentioned that it needed repairing, then immediately added that she had not yet found anyone trustworthy to do the work. Miss Marple murmured agreement, observing how some things were allowed to remain broken far longer than necessary. They sat in the small sitting room rather than the larger drawing room this time. Miss Marple noticed this change at once. The smaller room felt safer, more contained. Tea was brought in on a tray, already prepared, and Mrs. Everly set it down with visible relief, as though glad to have something solid to hold. As they talked, Miss Marple let her gaze wander gently. On the sideboard stood a small wooden box, its lid slightly askew. Mrs. Everly noticed Miss Marple looking and reached out, closing it with a faint click. "Just old papers," she said quickly. "Things one never quite gets around to sorting." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Old papers do have a way of lingering," she said. "They seem to wait for the right moment." Mrs. Everly laughed, but the sound lacked warmth. Her hand lingered on the box, fingers resting there as if guarding it. Conversation moved to ordinary matters. The weather. The upcoming 50. Miss Marple asked casually whether Mrs. Everly had found the missing silver. Mrs. Everly hesitated, then said that a spoon had turned up. She did not say where. She added that it was likely her own carelessness. Miss Marple nodded. Carelessness often appears at the most inconvenient times. Mrs. Everly's eyes flicked toward the door, then back again. Yes, inconvenient. There was a knock at the front door, sudden enough to make Mrs. Everly start. She rose at once, smoothing her skirt, and went to answer it. Miss Marple remained seated, listening. A man's voice came from the hall, low and unfamiliar. Mrs. Everly replied just as quietly. Their words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Tension. Urgency. The conversation ended abruptly, the door closing with care rather than force. Mrs. Everly returned, her color slightly heightened. "A tradesman," she said too quickly. "At the wrong address." Miss Marple accepted the explanation with polite ease. That does happen. But she had noticed something else. When Mrs. Everly came back into the room, her hand went briefly to her pocket, then withdrew empty, as though she had given something away. Or received it. They spoke on, but the rhythm had changed. Mrs. Everly's answers grew shorter, her attention divided. Miss Marple asked about the rest of the house, remarking how large it must feel now. "Oh, I do not use all of it," Mrs. Everly said. "Some rooms are better left alone." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Old houses can be like that. They remember more than we expect." Mrs. Everly's mouth tightened. "Yes." After a moment, she stood and said she must fetch something from the study. Miss Marple offered to accompany her, but Mrs. Everly declined at once too firmly, then softened her refusal with a smile. "It is terribly untidy," she said. "I would not want you to see it in such a state." Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze thoughtful. When Mrs. Everly left the room, Miss Marple listened carefully. The footsteps moved toward the back of the house, then paused. A drawer opened. Closed. Then another. Slower this time. There was the faint sound of metal touching wood. When Mrs. Everly returned, she carried a folded document. She placed it on the table, smoothing it with care. "I thought you might find this interesting," she said. "Old deeds. Nothing of importance, really." Miss Marple glanced at the document. It was not a deed at all, but a letter folded in thirds, its edges worn. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Miss Marple did not read it fully, but she saw enough to recognize a personal tone. Not official. Intimate. Mrs. Everly watched her closely. "I keep meaning to throw these things away." Miss Marple met her gaze gently. "Some letters are not so easily discarded." Mrs. Everly looked away. There was another knock, this time at the back door. Mrs. Everly flinched before composing herself again. "I must see to that," she said. Miss Marple rose as well. "Please do not trouble yourself on my account." But Mrs. Everly was already gone. Miss Marple stood alone for a moment, her eyes drawn once more to the small wooden box. She did not touch it. She did not need to. The box was locked, but the lock was new, far newer than the box itself. A replacement, fitted hastily. Mrs. Everly returned, breathless. "Forgive me." "A delivery." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course." They sat again, but the visit had reached its natural end. Miss Marple thanked her hostess and prepared to leave. As she stepped into the hallway, her attention was drawn to a narrow door near the stairs, the one Mrs. Everly had avoided before. Today, it stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple paused. "Is that a cupboard?" Mrs. Everly froze, just for a moment. Then she laughed lightly. "Oh, yes, just storage." Miss Marple did not press. She merely nodded and stepped outside. The air felt sharper than before. As Miss Marple walked down the path, she noticed marks in the soil near the side of the house. Footprints. More than one set. Recent. At the gate, she encountered Mrs. Pritchard, who was peering into the hedgerow with interest. "I was just saying," Mrs. Pritchard whispered, "that it is odd how many people seem to be coming and going lately. One never sees them properly. Only shapes. Shadows." Miss Marple agreed gently. Shadows often belong to someone. As she walked on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the study drawer, the new lock, the letter passed off as a deed, and the room that must not be seen. Each detail on its own was small, almost trivial. Together they formed a pattern of concealment. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window and watched the lights appear across the green. One by one they glowed, then dimmed. At Hawthorne Rise, an upstairs window remained lit long after the others had gone dark. Miss Marple observed the steady glow, the faint movement of a shadow crossing the curtain. She thought of old keys, locked drawers, and letters that arrived by hand. And as the clock in her own sitting room ticked evenly on, Miss Marple felt certain that somewhere inside Hawthorne Rise, a drawer had been opened that should have remained closed, and that whatever lay within it was drawing closer to the surface, ready to disturb the quiet order of the village. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the house was no longer merely restless, but hiding something it feared to reveal. Chapter 4. It was said afterward that the luncheon had been a pleasant one, and in the way of the village that was considered reason enough not to look too closely at it. The tables were laid with care, the soup served hot, and the cake praised politely. Yet Miss Marple, seated near the window where the winter light fell kindly, noticed that several conversations faltered whenever the same subject drifted too near. Hawthorne Rise was not mentioned outright at first, but its presence lingered like a draught in an otherwise warm room. The luncheon had been arranged by Mrs. Linton, who prided herself on order and hospitality. She moved briskly between tables, ensuring glasses were filled and plates cleared, her smile efficient and unwavering. Miss Marple observed how often Mrs. Linton's gaze flicked toward the door, as though expecting someone who had not yet arrived. Each time it did, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly before settling again. Miss Marple was seated beside Mrs. Grant, who leaned in almost at once, lowering her voice under the pleasant hum of chatter. "I should not say this," Mrs. Grant murmured, "but people are uneasy. You can feel it, can you not? As though something has been set in motion and no one knows quite how to stop it." Miss Marple smiled mildly. Unease does have a way of spreading, even without words. Across the table, Mrs. Pritchard dabbed her lips and said brightly that Mrs. Everly had declined her invitation to attend. She said it as though it were a trivial matter, but her eyes lingered on the empty chair a moment longer than necessary. Not like her, Mrs. Pritchard added. She is usually so attentive to social duties. Mrs. Finch replied, with a little shrug, that perhaps Mrs. Everly was simply tired. But she said it while stirring her soup without tasting it, her spoon circling again and again. Miss Marple noticed the rhythm and thought how habits often revealed more than words. Conversation shifted, as it always did, toward money. Mrs. Linton mentioned, rather pointedly, how difficult it had become to manage household expenses with prices rising. Mr. Hale, seated nearby, nodded vigorously and remarked that careful planning was essential. One cannot rely on old assurances, he said. Circumstances change. Miss Marple glanced at him. His tone was reasonable, but his fingers tapped lightly against the table edge. Once, twice, then stopped as though he had caught himself. Mrs. Grant laughed softly. Some assurances should not be broken so easily. Mr. Hale smiled, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Life is not sentimental. Miss Marple sipped her soup and thought how often sentiment was dismissed by those who feared it most. As the main course was served, Mrs. Linton took a seat at the head of the table. She began to speak of the upcoming fifth, outlining duties with brisk precision. Yet when someone asked whether Mrs. Everly might contribute as she usually did, Mrs. Linton paused. I am sure she will do what she can, she said. Her voice was smooth, but her hand tightened around her napkin. We must not pressure anyone. The remark was sensible, kind even, but it came with an edge of finality that drew Miss Marple's attention. Protection, perhaps, or control. During the meal, a small domestic detail drew Miss Marple's eye. A serving spoon lay slightly askew on the platter, its handle resting against the cloth. It bore faint initials. E.E. Most people would not have noticed. Miss Marple did. She said nothing, merely adjusted her place setting as though to give the spoon room. Mrs. Finch followed her gaze, and then quickly looked away, her cheeks coloring faintly. Later, as dessert was served, voices rose with a little more freedom. Mrs. Dawes leaned across the table and spoke in a tone meant to be light. I do hope Mrs. Everly is managing. Living alone in such a large house must be a burden. Mrs. Linton answered sharply. Mrs. Everly has always been capable. The word landed heavily. Mrs. Dawes murmured agreement and changed the subject, but the moment lingered. Miss Marple saw Mrs. Linton take a slow breath, as though steadying herself. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Grant. People often manage far longer than they should, she said gently. Mrs. Grant nodded. Until they cannot. At the far end of the table, Mrs. Pritchard was speaking in a lowered voice to Mr. Hale. Miss Marple caught only fragments as the general noise ebbed and flowed. Letters again. Told you not to. Mr. Hale's response was too soft to hear. But Miss Marple saw the way his posture stiffened, how his shoulders drew back defensively. Mrs. Pritchard finished speaking and sat back, her lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on her plate. A small pause fell, then conversation resumed with forced brightness. Mrs. Linton clapped her hands lightly and suggested coffee in the adjoining room. As they rose, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Finch lagging behind, adjusting her shawl with unnecessary care. She leaned in and whispered, I do not like this, then straightened quickly, as though embarrassed by the admission. Miss Marple touched her arm kindly. It is natural to feel unsettled when familiar things begin to shift. In the coffee room, the atmosphere felt more strained. Cups clinked. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Someone laughed a little too loudly at a remark that was not especially amusing. Miss Marple found herself standing near the window once more. Outside, the lane lay quiet, pale under the winter sky. A figure passed by, half obscured by the hedge. Miss Marple noted the time. It was earlier than the post usually arrived. Mrs. Linton joined her. I trust you are enjoying yourself, she said. Very much, Miss Marple replied, though one senses the village is carrying a great deal just now. Mrs. Linton's mouth tightened. Villages always do. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. But sometimes the weight becomes uneven. Mrs. Linton said nothing. Her gaze followed the figure outside until it disappeared. As the luncheon drew to a close, coats were fetched and goodbyes exchanged. Miss Marple prepared to leave. But Mrs. Linton caught her arm. Miss Marple, she said quietly, you understand how easily people misunderstand one another. Miss Marple met her eyes. Misunderstandings often grow where there is silence. Mrs. Linton released her arm. I only hope no one is hurt by idle talk. Miss Marple smiled gently. Idle talk rarely remains idle for long. Outside, the air was crisp. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the green, her thoughts carefully ordered. She had seen fear in polite smiles, heard tension beneath ordinary words, and sensed loyalties being tested. Near the edge of the path, she noticed something dark against the pale gravel. A glove. A woman's glove. It lay palm up, fingers slightly curled, as though dropped in haste. Miss Marple picked it up and examined it briefly. Inside, stitched neatly, were the initials EE. She did not react outwardly. She simply held the glove, feeling the weight of it in her hand. A glove could be lost easily enough, but lost things had a way of appearing at moments of significance. Miss Marple looked back toward the village, toward Hawthorne Rise beyond it, where the hedges concealed more than they revealed. Polite faces had shown cracks today. Private fears had slipped into public spaces. As she turned for home, Miss Marple felt certain that the tensions she had witnessed were not the result of gossip alone, but of something pressing closer to disclosure. And as the afternoon light faded, she knew that beneath the careful civility of luncheon tables and kind words, a deeper unease was gathering its strength, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. Chapter 5. The news traveled before the bells had finished ringing. It moved from door to door in lowered voices, passed across counters with wrapped loaves, and exchanged at garden gates under the pretense of weather. By the time Miss Marple heard it spoken aloud, the words had already taken on weight. Something had happened at Hawthorne Rise during the night. Something final. Miss Marple was standing at her window when Mrs. Grant appeared on the path below, her coat hastily buttoned, her hat crooked in a way that spoke of urgency rather than fashion. She looked up, saw Miss Marple, and raised her hand in a small, helpless gesture. Miss Marple understood at once and went to the door before the knock came. It is Mrs. Everleigh, Mrs. Grant said, breathless. Or rather, it is the house. They found him this morning. Miss Marple did not ask who. The village rarely needed names in such moments. She took her shawl calmly, thanked Mrs. Grant for telling her, and set off at an unhurried pace that contrasted sharply with the tension tightening the air. Hawthorne Rise stood as it always had, neat and well kept. Yet something about it felt altered. The front door was open wider than usual, and a constable stood just inside, his cap held respectfully in his hands. Miss Marple noted the detail immediately. Doors were closed when things were under control. Open doors meant disturbance. She was greeted quietly and ushered into the sitting room, where several familiar faces gathered with the awkward closeness of people who did not quite know where to stand. Mrs. Linton was there, pale but composed, her posture rigid with effort. Mrs. Finch sat near the window, twisting her gloves in her lap. Mr. Hale stood apart, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on a spot above the mantel. Miss Marple took a seat and listened. The body had been found in the small side room near the stairs, the one Mrs. Everleigh had always avoided, the one she had called storage. A man not from the village, known only vaguely as an associate of the household, had been discovered there early in the morning. The explanation offered was sudden illness. The tone suggested that explanation was already insufficient. Miss Marple heard it all with a mild expression, but her attention moved elsewhere. She noticed the chair by the fireplace had been shifted again, now positioned slightly closer to the door. She noticed a faint smear on the edge of the rug, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. She noticed that the hallway clock was silent. Stopped in the night, Mrs. Everly said softly from where she sat, wrapped in a shawl, though the room was warm. Her voice sounded far away, as though she were speaking through layers of cotton. It has never done that before. Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. Clocks can be sensitive, she said gently. They often stop when something unsettles them. Mrs. Everly looked at her sharply, then away. A quiet exchange took place between the constable and Mrs. Linton near the doorway. Miss Marple did not need to hear the words to sense their tone. Careful. Controlled. Protective. Mrs. Finch spoke at last, her voice trembling. I cannot imagine how it happened. One moment everything seemed well enough. Mr. Hale shifted. Things are not always as they appear. The remark fell heavily into the room. Miss Marple saw several heads turn toward him. He flushed slightly, then added quickly, I only mean that illness can come without warning. Miss Marple watched him carefully. His composure was strained. His usual eagerness to appear helpful had given way to a guarded stillness. The constable cleared his throat. We will need to ask a few questions. Mrs. Everly nodded mechanically. Of course, Miss Marple observed how her fingers gripped the edge of the shawl, then loosened, then tightened again. She asked no questions herself. She did not need to. Others were eager enough to fill the silence. He was seen here last evening, Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice hushed but insistent. I saw him myself. Coming up the path after dark, Mrs. Linton shot her a warning look. Now is not the time. Mrs. Pritchard flushed. I only meant that people should know. Miss Marple thought how often the phrase people should know preceded far more damage than silence ever did. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's attention drifted to small things. The narrow door to the side room stood closed now, its handle newly polished, as though someone had wiped it carefully. The smell of cleaning solution lingered faintly in the air, sharp beneath the comforting scent of tea. Miss Marple asked, in a mild tone, whether Mrs. Everly had slept at all. Very little, Mrs. Everly replied. There were noises, movement. I assumed it was the house settling. Miss Marple nodded. Old houses are prone to that. Yes, Mrs. Everly said, her voice barely above a whisper. Old houses. When the constable stepped away to confer with another officer, the room fell into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple rose and moved slowly toward the window, as though stretching her legs. From there, she could see the path leading to the side of the house. The soil bore faint impressions, more distinct now in the daylight. Footprints overlapping, hurried, confused. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Finch murmur to Mrs. Linton, The letters. I told you this would come of them. Mrs. Linton replied sharply, Not here. Miss Marple pretended not to hear, though every word settled into place in her thoughts. A tray of tea was brought in, an act of habit rather than comfort. Cups were poured, hands shook. One cup was filled and left untouched. Miss Marple accepted a cup and noticed something else. The spoon placed beside it was plain. Not the silver from Hawthorne Rise. Miss Marple thought of the spoon found in the hedgerow, the serving spoon at luncheon, the careful effort to account for what was missing. Mrs. Everly spoke again, her voice steadier now. He had papers with him. He said he wished to discuss them privately. Miss Marple looked up. Did he? Yes. In the side room, and the papers, Miss Marple asked gently. Are they still there? Mrs. Everly hesitated. I believe so. Mr. Hale spoke suddenly. This is all very distressing. Perhaps we should allow the authorities to do their work without speculation. Miss Marple turned toward him, her expression kind. Speculation thrives where facts are withheld. Mr. Hale said nothing, but his jaw tightened. The constable returned and announced that the room where the man was found would remain closed. No one was to enter. Mrs. Everly nodded, her face pale. As people began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered near the hallway. She paused beside the narrow door and noticed a fine scratch near the lock, fresh and pale against the wood. A key had been used in haste, or the wrong key forced to turn. Outside, the village gathered in small knots, speaking softly. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the green, her mind calm, her heart heavy with certainty. She passed Mrs. Dawes, who whispered, "They say it was sudden. But nothing about that house feels sudden anymore." Miss Marple agreed quietly. As she reached the bend in the lane, she looked back once more at Hawthorne Rise. The upstairs window was dark now, the curtain drawn tight. The house appeared closed, sealed against the world. But Miss Marple knew better. Houses did not keep secrets. People did. And people, when pressed by fear and desperation, made mistakes. And as the village settled into an uneasy hush, Miss Marple felt certain that the silence broken that morning would not mend itself easily, and that what had been discovered in the quiet side room was only the beginning of a far more unsettling truth waiting to be spoken. Chapter 6. By the next day, the village had shifted into a different manner of speaking. Words were chosen more carefully now, sentences left unfinished. Doors closed a little more firmly, curtains drawn a little earlier. The name Hawthorne Rise was still spoken, but softly, as though it might overhear. Miss Marple noticed these changes as she always did, without comment, allowing the village to reveal itself at its own pace. She began her morning with a walk, choosing a path that took her past the postbox, and along the lane that curved gently toward Hawthorne Rise. There was nothing unusual in this. Miss Marple often walked for the sake of fresh air and quiet thought. Yet today, she paid close attention to what the village offered freely to anyone willing to observe. At the postbox, Mrs. Dawes stood holding a letter she had not yet posted. She turned when she saw Miss Marple and gave a small, uncertain smile. "I nearly forgot myself just now," Mrs. Dawes said. "Came out without checking the address twice." Miss Marple smiled. "One's thoughts do wander at times like these." Mrs. Dawes nodded. "I cannot help thinking about the letters. All those letters coming and going. It makes one uneasy, does it not?" "It can," Miss Marple replied gently. "Especially when letters arrive at times they should not." Mrs. Dawes hesitated, then leaned closer. "They have stopped now. The late deliveries, I mean. Nothing came last night." Miss Marple considered this. "That is interesting." Mrs. Dawes looked relieved to have said it, and quickly changed the subject, wishing Miss Marple a pleasant morning before moving on. Miss Marple continued along the lane. Near the hedge bordering Hawthorne Rise, she paused briefly. The ground still bore marks from the previous day, though they were already beginning to soften under careful feet and passing time. Someone had made an effort to smooth them. Miss Marple noted this, thinking how the desire to erase often revealed more than neglect ever could. She did not go to the house. Not yet. Instead, she turned back toward the village and called upon Mrs. Finch, who welcomed her with a strange cheerfulness. "I am glad you came," Mrs. Finch said, ushering her into the sitting room. "It is such a comfort to talk of ordinary things." They spoke of ordinary things indeed. Jam making. A cracked teacup. The difficulty of keeping dust from settling. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and asked a few mild questions. Gradually, as she expected, the conversation drifted. "I keep thinking," Mrs. Finch said at last, lowering her voice, "that if people had been more honest earlier, none of this would have happened." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Honesty often arrives too late." Mrs. Finch sighed. Mrs. Everly trusted the wrong people. Or perhaps she trusted too many. Miss Marple looked up. Trust can be complicated. Mrs. Finch glanced toward the door, then back again. There were arrangements. Financial ones. Everyone knew that, though no one said it outright. And the man who was found? Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Finch nodded. He was not meant to stay. That much I am certain of. Miss Marple asked no more. She did not need to. Mrs. Finch had already revealed more than she realized. Later, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Hale outside the grocer's. He greeted her with careful politeness, though his usual ease was absent. He spoke of the weather, of supply shortages, of anything that did not matter. Miss Marple listened patiently, then remarked, I imagine the last few days have been trying for you. Mr. Hale's smile faltered. Trying for everyone. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But some trials are more personal than others. He shifted his weight. I have always believed in keeping matters orderly. Order, Miss Marple said gently, can be very comforting. He nodded, then added, a little too quickly, I hope Mrs. Everly will recover from this shock. Miss Marple watched his face as she replied. Shock fades. Consequences remain. Mr. Hale said nothing further. He excused himself soon after, leaving Miss Marple standing alone with her thoughts. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a message delivered by hand. Mrs. Linton wished to see her. The request was formal, though the handwriting wavered slightly, betraying its urgency. Mrs. Linton received her in the dining room, the table set though no meal had been prepared. She gestured for Miss Marple to sit, then remained standing herself for a moment longer, as though unsure whether to commit. I wanted to speak to you privately, Mrs. Linton said. You are observant. Miss Marple smiled mildly. I notice what is placed before me. Mrs. Linton folded her hands. People are beginning to say things. Unhelpful things. They usually do, Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Linton hesitated. You understand how easily reputations can be damaged. Indeed, Miss Marple said. They are often more fragile than we admit. Mrs. Linton's voice tightened. Mrs. Everly is not a bad woman. Miss Marple met her gaze. I have never thought so. Relief flickered across Mrs. Linton's face, quickly replaced by tension. Then you must see how important it is to keep certain matters quiet. Quiet, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, can protect. It can also suffocate. Mrs. Linton turned away, her back stiff. There are things I wish I had never known. Miss Marple said nothing. Silence at times was the kindest response. When Miss Marple left, the afternoon had grown gray. She walked slowly, her thoughts aligning themselves like pieces laid gently into place. Letters delivered late. Footsteps smoothed away. A man not meant to stay. Arrangements that had gone wrong. As she neared Hawthorne Rise, she saw Mrs. Everly standing at the gate. She looked smaller somehow, as though the house behind her had begun to loom. I hoped I might see you, Mrs. Everly said quietly. Miss Marple joined her at the gate. How are you feeling? Mrs. Everly gave a short laugh, as though I am being watched by my own walls. Miss Marple regarded the house. Homes can become oppressive when they hold too much. Mrs. Everly's hands twisted together. I did not intend for things to happen as they did. Miss Marple nodded. Intentions rarely guide outcomes. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Everly spoke again. The papers he brought, they are gone. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. Gone. Yes. I looked for them this morning. They were not where he said he had placed them. Miss Marple considered this. And who else knew of them? Mrs. Everly hesitated. More people than I should have allowed. Miss Marple rested her hand briefly on the gate. Secrets lose their power once they are shared too freely. Mrs. Everly's eyes filled, but she did not cry. I was afraid. Fear, Miss Marple said gently, is a persuasive force. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by her window as dusk settled. The village moved quietly now, as though aware it was being observed in return. Lights came on, then off. At Hawthorne Rise, the lower windows remained dark, but a faint glow appeared briefly in the side room before vanishing. Miss Marple watched, her expression calm, her thoughts precise. Someone had returned. Someone had remembered something too late or too clearly. The disappearance of the papers was not an accident. It was an act of necessity. As the light faded completely, Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The truth was beginning to emerge, not through confession or force, but through absence. Missing letters, missing papers, missing trust. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly to herself, knew that whoever had removed those documents had revealed more by doing so than they ever would have by leaving them behind, and that the answer she sought was no longer hidden in what could be found, but in what someone had been desperate enough to take away. Chapter 7. It was said later that Miss Marple had invited everyone quite by accident. Mrs. Grant believed it was coincidence, Mrs. Finch thought it simple kindness, and Mr. Hale assured himself that it meant nothing at all. Yet by late afternoon, a small but deliberate gathering had formed in the drawing room of Mrs. Linton's house, drawn together by politeness, and an unspoken sense that something unfinished was pressing for attention. Miss Marple arrived last, as she often did. Removing her gloves with careful precision, she looked about the room with mild approval, noting the way the chairs had been arranged closer than usual, as though conversation itself required encouragement. The fire burned steadily, its warmth at odds with the tension settling quietly among the guests. Mrs. Everleigh sat near the window, her hands folded in her lap. She appeared composed, though Miss Marple noticed how she sat forward rather than leaning back, as if ready to rise at any moment. Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Grant occupied the sofa, whispering until Mrs. Linton cleared her throat and brought the room to order. Mr. Hale stood near the mantel, adjusting an ornament that did not require adjustment. He smiled politely when Miss Marple greeted him, but his eyes did not linger. Miss Marple took her seat opposite him, placing her handbag neatly beside her chair. "It is good of you all to come," Mrs. Linton said briskly. "Given recent events, I thought it best we speak plainly, at least among ourselves." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Plain speaking can be a relief," Mrs. Linton nodded, though she did not quite meet Miss Marple's eyes. Tea was poured. Cups were passed. One saucer rattled faintly as it was set down. Miss Marple noticed whose hand had trembled. Conversation began cautiously. Mrs. Grant spoke of how unsettling the past days had been, how the village no longer felt quite itself. Mrs. Finch agreed, adding that people were beginning to imagine dangers where none existed. "Imagination thrives on silence," Miss Marple remarked quietly. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. "There has been enough talk already. Speculation only makes matters worse." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly, "or does it simply bring what is already present into the open?" Mr. Hale shifted. "We should leave conclusions to those officially responsible." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course. Though understanding often begins elsewhere." There was a pause, filled by the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple took a sip of tea and set her cup down with deliberate care. "I have been thinking," she said gently, "about the man who came to Hawthorne Rise, about why he came and why he stayed longer than intended." Mrs. Everleigh's fingers tightened together. Mrs. Finch spoke quickly. "He was involved in arrangements. That is all." "Arrangements," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Such a flexible word," Mrs. Linton interjected. "Whatever those arrangements were, they do not justify what happened." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "They explain it." The words settled heavily into the room. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm, conversational. "In villages, we often mistake discretion for safety. We assume that if matters are kept quiet, they cannot cause harm. But secrecy has a way of attracting pressure." Mrs. Everleigh looked up. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt." Miss Marple met her gaze kindly. "I believe you." Mr. Hale's hand moved again toward his breast pocket, then stopped. Miss Marple saw it, as she had seen it before. "The letters," Miss Marple said, as though remembering something only just now. "They arrived late. They were delivered by hand. And then they stopped." Mrs. Grant drew in a small breath. "You noticed that—" "I noticed patterns," Miss Marple replied. Letters often tell us who expects answers. Mrs. Finch spoke sharply. Those letters were private. Indeed, Miss Marple said, which makes it curious that more than one person knew of them. Silence fell again. Miss Marple allowed it to stretch, knowing that unease often loosened tongues. And the papers, she continued. The ones brought to Hawthorne Rise and later removed. Mrs. Everleigh's voice shook. They were meant to protect me. From whom? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Everleigh hesitated. From financial ruin. From promises that should never have been made. Miss Marple nodded. Promises made in private often demand payment in public. Mr. Hale shifted his stance. This is unfair, he said. You are suggesting things without proof? Miss Marple turned toward him fully now. Am I? Or am I repeating what the village has already seen? She leaned forward slightly, her voice still soft. You recovered financially very suddenly, Mr. Hale. At the same time, letters began arriving at Hawthorne Rise. Letters that spoke of obligations, of delayed settlements, of consequences. Mrs. Linton looked at Mr. Hale sharply. Is that true? Mr. Hale's smile faltered. Coincidence. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Coincidences are rare in small places. She continued, her words flowing evenly. The man who died was not an intruder. He was expected. But he stayed too long. He pressed too hard. And when fear meets desperation, control slips. Mrs. Finch whispered, You think it was an accident? I think, Miss Marple said, that it was a moment. A single moment that cannot be undone. Mrs. Everleigh covered her face briefly, then lowered her hands. He threatened to expose everything. Miss Marple nodded. Threats change the nature of agreements. Mr. Hale spoke again, his voice sharper now. You cannot prove who was involved. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. No. But I can observe who removed the papers afterward. Mr. Hale froze. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The documents vanished not to hide guilt, but to regain control. Only someone who feared their contents more than discovery would take such a risk, Mrs. Linton whispered. Mr. Hale. He laughed abruptly. This is absurd. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Is it? You knew where the papers were kept. You knew the side room. You had reason to ensure those documents never reached official eyes. Mr. Hale's composure cracked. His shoulders sagged slightly, as though a weight had finally been acknowledged. I only wanted it to stop, he said. The letters. The visits. The constant threat of exposure. Miss Marple nodded. Fear often convinces us we are acting reasonably. Mrs. Everleigh spoke, her voice quiet. I did not invite him that night. Miss Marple looked at her. No. He came because he believed leverage gave him power. The room felt very still now, as though everyone were listening for something beyond the walls. Miss Marple folded her hands. The truth is nearly complete. What remains is not who intended harm, but who failed to prevent it. Mr. Hale sank into a chair. I never meant for him to die, Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Few ever do. Outside, the light was fading. The fire burned lower. Miss Marple rose slowly, her movements unhurried. There is one thing left, she said gently. One detail that has not yet spoken. She looked toward Mrs. Everleigh. The clock at Hawthorne Rise. It stopped at the moment of disturbance. Not from age, but from impact. Mrs. Everleigh closed her eyes. Miss Marple continued softly. Someone fell. Someone struck the cabinet beneath the clock, and time, quite literally, stopped. No one spoke. Miss Marple gathered her gloves. What happened next will unfold without our help. But the shape of the truth is clear now. She paused at the door and turned back, her expression kind but resolute. The quiet of this village has been broken, not by malice alone, but by fear allowed to grow unchecked. As she stepped into the evening, Miss Marple knew the final answers were no longer hidden. The last shadows had begun to thin, and the truth, patient and persistent, was ready to step fully into the light. Chapter 8. The village gathered with a carefulness that spoke of restraint rather than calm. People arrived at Hawthorne Rise not out of curiosity now, but out of obligation, drawn by the quiet certainty that whatever had unsettled their days was about to be named. The house itself seemed subdued, its windows dark, its door opening without hesitation, as though it had surrendered the effort of concealment. Miss Marple arrived in her usual manner, unhurried, her presence neither commanding nor timid. She paused briefly in the hallway, listening. The grandfather clock had been repaired, its ticking now even and steady, a sound that felt almost intrusive after days of silence. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging an old acquaintance restored to honesty. They gathered in the larger drawing room. Mrs. Everleigh stood near the fireplace, her face pale but composed. Mrs. Linton sat rigidly on a straight-backed chair, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had blanched. Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Grant occupied the sofa, their usual whispering absent, replaced by watchful quiet. Mr. Hale stood apart, closer to the door than necessary, as though already measuring the distance to leave. Miss Marple took her seat and waited. Silence was a useful thing when allowed to settle. At times like this, Miss Marple said gently, people often expect a dramatic moment. Raised voices. Accusations. But the truth rarely requires such effort. It has been speaking all along. Mrs. Everleigh drew a breath. I would like it said plainly, she murmured. No more guessing. Miss Marple nodded. Very well. She did not stand. She did not gesture. She simply spoke, her voice calm, measured, and clear. The man who died came to Hawthorne Rise believing he held power. He had letters that suggested obligations, financial promises made quietly, without witnesses, and therefore dangerously. He believed that by reminding certain people of those promises, he could secure his own position. Mrs. Finch closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Grant clasped her hands together. He was not invited that night, Miss Marple continued. He came because he thought pressure would succeed where patience had failed. He waited in the side room, the one rarely used, the one that felt safe for secrecy. Mrs. Everleigh's voice trembled. I asked him to leave. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, you did. But fear had already altered the balance. She turned her gaze toward Mr. Hale, not accusing, merely attentive. You had more to lose than anyone else, Miss Marple said. Your sudden financial recovery depended on those arrangements remaining unseen. The letters arriving late, the resealed envelopes, the visits after dark. All signs of a negotiation that had gone on far too long. Mr. Hale swallowed. I did not mean for it to end as it did. No, Miss Marple agreed quietly. You meant for it to end conveniently. The room held its breath. You went to the house that night, Miss Marple continued, not to cause harm, but to regain control. The man refused to leave. Words were exchanged. He stepped back. You reached out. Perhaps not to strike, but to stop him. Mrs. Linton whispered, the clock. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. The impact jarred the cabinet beneath it. The clock stopped at that precise moment. Not coincidence. Confirmation. Mr. Hale's shoulders sagged. He fell. I did not push him hard. Miss Marple met his eyes kindly. It only takes a moment. Mrs. Everleigh spoke then, her voice steadier than it had been in days. I heard the sound. I thought it was the house settling. I was afraid to look. Miss Marple nodded. Fear keeps many doors closed. Mr. Hale lowered himself into a chair, his composure finally gone. Afterward, I panicked. The papers were still there. I knew what they meant, and so you returned, Miss Marple said. You removed them. You smoothed the footprints. You hoped absence would erase consequence. Mrs. Finch whispered, but it never does. Miss Marple smiled gently. No. It only redirects it. She let the silence stretch, allowing the truth to settle fully into the room. There is something important to say, Miss Marple added. This was not a crime born of cruelty. It was born of fear, secrecy, and the belief that quiet agreements could remain harmless forever. Mr. Hale bowed his head. I am sorry, Miss Marple regarded him with compassion. Regret comes easily. Responsibility does not. There was a knock at the door. Firm. Certain. The constable entered, respectful but resolute. Miss Marple rose then, smoothing her gloves. I believe, she said gently, you will find matters clearer now. Mrs. Everleigh closed her eyes as the constable approached Mr. Hale. Mrs. Linton looked away. Mrs. Grant pressed a hand to her mouth. As Mr. Hale was led from the room, the house felt suddenly lighter, as though something long held had finally been released. The constable departed. The door closed. No one spoke for a moment. At last, Mrs. Everleigh exhaled shakily. It is over. Miss Marple nodded. The worst part is, she rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the hedges were neat again. The lane quiet, the village returning cautiously to itself. Hawthorne Rise will sleep now, Miss Marple said. Not because it has forgotten, but because it no longer has to remember in silence. Mrs. Everleigh turned toward her. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled kindly. People reveal themselves through what they try hardest to hide. Trembling hands, avoided rooms, letters opened and resealed, and fear. Always fear. She gathered her handbag and moved toward the door. As she stepped into the evening, the village bells began to ring. Not urgently now, but steadily, marking the hour. Miss Marple paused, listening to the sound carry across the green. Quiet returned, not as concealment, but as peace. And Miss Marple, walking home beneath the fading light, knew that the loudest secrets were never those spoken aloud, but those finally allowed to end. The village did not speak of Hawthorne Rise for some time afterward. Not because it wished to forget, but because it needed to remember carefully. Windows were opened again. Curtains were drawn back. The familiar rhythms of ordinary life returned, steady and reassuring, as though the village itself were relearning how to breathe. Mrs. Everleigh remained at Hawthorne Rise, though the house no longer felt watchful. Rooms were opened that had long been avoided, and sunlight was allowed to rest where shadows once lingered. She moved more slowly now, but with a sense of quiet relief, as though a burden she had carried alone had finally been set down. Mr. Hale's absence was noted politely and discussed less and less as days passed. The village understood, in its own gentle way, that some names faded best when not repeated. Miss Marple resumed her usual habits. She attended church, exchanged greetings, and listened as she always had. Yet those who watched closely thought her smile carried a deeper calm, the kind that followed resolution rather than curiosity. One evening, as the lights of the village came on one by one, Miss Marple reflected that secrets were rarely loud by nature. They grew loud only when ignored. Left unattended, they pressed and twisted, until something gave. Peace, she knew, was not the absence of truth, but its quiet acceptance. And with that understanding settled firmly in her heart, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, content that the village, and the house at its edge, had finally learned to rest.